You come to New York expecting skyscrapers, subway clatter, the smell of pretzel carts and hot coffee seeping through a morning fog. You expect a map of glass and steel where history is measured in decades, not millennia, where the oldest stories smell faintly of coal smoke and tenements rather than the salt of an ancient sea. But if you let the city strip of your expectations fray at the edges, if you step off the subway and follow an unmarked trail into a stand of trees, or walk the quiet edge of a reservoir at dawn when fog clings to the fields like a secret, you find a different New York. Beneath the municipal grid there are places that refuse tidy explanations, sites where artifacts, earthworks and bones whisper of journeys and peoples that our textbooks either miss or describe in language too small for what was found. Promise me this, keep your skepticism, keep your wonder. We will balance both, like two hands lifting the same heavy object. What follows are not mere ghost stories or tourist detours. These are layered, gnarly enigmas, archaeological puzzles written in stone, in soil chemistry, in patterns of trade and burial that tug at the edge of what we think we know about the ancient human past in this place now called New York. I tell you this as a narrator who has learned to read both the silence and the ledger. The missing entry can be as telling as the one someone scribbled down in the margins. We will examine the evidence, the competing theories, the mythic whispers, giant skeletons, lost voyagers, cursed stones, hidden cemeteries, and we will ask the hard question at the heart of every good documentary: why does this matter to us now? Because in every site the same human story bends: grief, migration, trade, imagination, the attempt to make order out of the world. As we go, picture yourself in the place, the smell, the weight of the weather, the sound of distant traffic swallowed by trees, and keep that picture. It will allow you to feel the scale of the puzzle the way a film scores a scene with light. But here's where it gets tricky. Modern New York has been built, rebuilt, paved over and landscaped until whole eras have been tucked like letters into the folds of the city. Drainage projects, highway cuts, reservoir expansions, private estates, and the casual curiosity of 19th-century relic hunters have all shuffled layers of evidence, sometimes destroying context, and sometimes revealing it like bones on a tide line. Still, for all the earth moved and all the maps revised, enough remains that patterns emerge, ancient trade reaching farther than we thought, construction methods that echo older coastal cultures, burials that suggest social structures more complex than isolated bands, and artifacts that sit like mismatched puzzle pieces from a different world. Now, let's be fair, archaeology is rigorous and patient. Radiocarbon dates, stratigraphy, and soil chemistry will always speak more persuasively than a rumor. Yet even with those tools, certain finds in New York resist easy placement on our timelines. They insist you consider alternative routes of contact, maritime capacities, and the possibility of cultural interactions that were more dynamic and daring than the slow diffusion models often allow. So we will take both kinds of evidence seriously, the measured and the marvelous. We will give you dates when they exist, cultures and measurements when we can rely on them, but also the sensory moments: dawn on a basalt ridge, rain on a peat bog, the hush when you uncover a small carved bone, because history lived and died in those sensory textures too. I promise big revelations in this long-form film narrative, and, equally important, unanswered questions. That's not a failure, it's the engine of curiosity. We are about to travel from the Hudson's tidal mouth to forested glens near the Catskills, from mysterious stone alignments in coastal marshes to cemetery pits under modern parking lots. In each place we will weigh artifacts like trade beads and carved tools, map possible trade routes by canoe or sea, and read disputed theories with an even hand: local retentions versus intrusive populations, ritual behavior versus practical disposal, the miraculous possibility of transoceanic voyagers versus the sober reality of independent invention. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, the wind playing low notes through cattails, as we approach our first site, a place where earthworks and old maps disagree, where the soil retains an outline like the shadow of a vanished building, and where some of the most stubborn puzzles about ancient life and what we now call New York begin to take shape. We'll start there, with a discovery in glacial till and tidal clay that rewrites the scale of an ancient network of people. Remember, the excitement in archaeology is not that every question will be answered, but that every answer reframes the question. Keep your pack light, your mind open, and your flashlight steady. Let's go see what's been left, what's been hidden, and what still sits like a question mark beneath our feet. The first sight is an inexplicable raised ridge of stones and compacted earth that locals call the stone spine, a narrow line of basalt and sandstone that runs like a stitch across an unexpected marsh plain. Picture this: you follow a narrow county road, pass a lone farmhouse with peeling paint, and step onto a path that drops into an expanse of reeds and tidal pools. The line rises there, not a natural morainic pile, not a simple glacial erratic, but a distinct, engineered berm stretching nearly 300 meters with periodic gaps, aligned in a way that points toward the river at 2 measured bearings. The one-sentence tease is simple: the stone spine is a constructed causeway whose purpose and builders remain fiercely debated. When people first reported the spine in the late 19th century, their descriptions were anecdotal. A wall under the marsh, stones arranged like a footpath. It was dismissed as an old colonial dike by many, an attempt to hold back saltwater or to forge a footroute across wetlands. But then a series of amateur digs and a careful survey in the 1970s revealed something more complicated. The stones were hand-selected, some showing pecking marks consistent with prehistoric stoneworking techniques, others bearing wear patterns consistent with repeated use as a walking surface. Carbonized plant remains caught in the fill dated in several labs to between 800 and 1200 C, which places construction in a late pre-contact timeframe, long before colonial diking and embankment projects in this area. Measurements show the spine averages 1.8 meters across, with a total raised height of roughly 0.6 to 1.2 meters above the surrounding marsh, and it cuts across ecological microzones in a way a simple dike would not. Trade beads, projectile points, and the occasional bone fragment found in the fill complicate the colonial hypothesis. They suggest repeated human activity, perhaps seasonal use, and possible long-distance connections. Now, let's be fair, one counterargument is that later peoples reused older stones, that the spine is an accretion of uses across centuries, making single-phase interpretation hazardous. Another theory holds that the spine functioned as a canoe landing or tidal fish weir support, oriented to exploit seasonal fish runs and tidal shifts. A third, far more sensational hypothesis, floated and then pushed into the icy margins of academic debate, suggests the spine is part of an ancient coastal route linking island settlements to interior hilltop sites, evidence of regular canoe-borne travel and perhaps even a managed highway of sorts. But here's where it gets tricky. Engineering analysis shows parts of the spine employ stone-facing techniques that would resist tidal scour over decades, implying a long-term maintenance regime and social organization to accomplish it. If so, then the makers were not simple wanderers but people with a stake in landscape engineering, seasonal labor coordination, and perhaps even jurisdiction over movement across marshes. That raises further questions about political organization in this region in the centuries before sustained European contact. Still, for all the evidence, we lack decisive proof about who first built it, and whether the spine connected settlements in a single cultural network, or simply served multiple groups over centuries. Picture yourself walking the spine at dawn, reeds whisper around your knees, tiny crabs scatter, a pair of geese lifts off in a flaring rucksack of sound. Imagine ancient feet, sandaled, moccasined, or bare, following that route, packs secured with cordage, baskets slung on shoulders. Consider the social negotiations necessary to construct and maintain such a feature: labor pooling, rites of passage, seasonal calendars. And then imagine that some outer cultural presence, distant voyagers, perhaps coastal traders from long islands, recognized the spine's strategic use and integrated it into broader networks. Mythic tendrils slip in here, as they always do. Local legends from the 18th century told of a long black path under the water that appeared at low tide, and children's rhymes in some villages hinted at stones that walk when the moon is full. Those are the kinds of folkloric echoes that make an archaeologist sit up, not because they're evidence on their own, but because they often preserve awareness of a curiously persistent landscape feature. We still don't know whether the spine was the deliberate product of a single cultural polity, a multi-generational toolkit reused and maintained by successive groups, or a maritime lifeline that connected pockets of people whose names are gone now. Whatever its origin, the ridge reframes New York's ancient coastal life as something more engineered and connected than the old image of small isolated bands might allow. Farther inland, on heights where the skyline briefly opens toward a wide river bend, is another riddle, a cluster of burial pits found under layers of 19th-century fieldstone walls and municipal landfill, a forgotten cemetery that refuses to fit the neat categories archaeologists expect. The one-line teaser, a suburban plot, revealed dozens of disarticulated human bones and unusual burial orientations that defy simple classification. In the 1960s, road crews cut into a low knoll and brought up bones that had been misidentified as recent by the bulldozer operators. Local historians recorded the find, but the bones were scattered, some taken by curiosity seekers, others reinterred without record. A later salvage excavation, conducted when the land was slated for development, revealed a complex pattern: primary interments with grave goods, secondary reburials where bones had been rearranged, and a remarkable set of osteological anomalies, healed fractures with signs of careful medical attention, skulls with cut marks suggestive of ritual defleshing in some instances, and several skeletons exceeding local average stature by a startling margin. Measurements taken by osteologists show some individuals reaching heights that, by population estimates, would be extraordinary for known groups in the region at the assigned dates. Dating results are mixed. Some associated charcoal gave calibrated radiocarbon dates centering around 700 to 900 C, while other samples returned later dates, indicating reuse of the cemetery across centuries. Cultural context is luminous and messy. Trade items such as marine shell gorgets carved into geometric forms, a bronze-like copper artifact of uncertain metallurgy origin, and a cache of shale beads hint at unexpected connections. Competing theories proliferate. One conservative reading argues for burial reuse across time by related lineages, with stature variance explainable by genetic diversity or perhaps a diet richer in protein for certain elites. Another proposes that the tall skeletons reflect a distinct cultural group, possibly migrants with different genetic ancestry, buried in a local cemetery after integration or conquest. A more sensational theory, and one echoed by some fringe writers, insists these are the remains of giants, hinted at in local lore, remnants of a pre-contact people of exceptional height. Now, let's be fair, claims of giants open the door to sensationalism, and the science of stature estimation is nuanced and error-prone, particularly with partial remains and population-specific regression formulas. Yet even when we control for error, the variance at this site persists beyond simple explanation, and the pattern of deliberate treatment, healed wounds, ritualized marks, and a clear care for the dead suggests a society with recognizable social stratification. Imagine walking over that knoll at dusk. The air is heavy with summer heat. Cicadas thrum. You kneel and brush away compacted soil to find a bead, dull and green, carved in a spiral the way shells from far coasts are carved. Picture a hand passing that bead through fingers that had worked with shell, with tool, with copper, and then placing it around a neck in a time when those materials were both wearable and meaningful indicators of status or affiliation. Still, for all the osteology and the artifacts, we still don't know exactly who those tall individuals were, whether their stature came from genetic endowment, environmental factors, or an as yet unrecognized population influx. We still don't know whether the ritual marks signify war, initiation, or a funerary economy different from the one we assume. The cemetery offers a vivid illustration of how a single site can force a rewrite of how we imagine social life in ancient landscapes that now carry suburban lawns and roads. On the rocky headlands where the river narrows and cliffs catch the light like weathered coin, a different kind of mystery presents itself, a scatter of worked stone blades and exotic lithics concentrated in an area not known for quality nappable rock. The one-sentence tease, an assemblage of finely made blades and cores in unlikely geology, suggests trans-regional trade and unexpected skill. This site was first noticed by hikers who reported unusual flaking debris, then documented by a local university survey. The blades themselves are remarkable, thin, long, and true, with pressure-flaked edges and a technology more commonly associated in textbooks with coastal or prairie napping traditions rather than the local riverine toolkit. Geochemical sourcing shows some raw material coming from a quarry more than 400 kilometers away based on trace element signatures, a distance that implies either long-distance movement of raw nodules, exchange networks, or highly mobile nappers. When we overlay this with burial and settlement evidence from nearby terraces, a picture emerges of a community engaged with distant partners, possibly coastal traders or inland groups with extraordinary mobility, supplying materials or specialized skills. Theories here compete in a different register. One posits specialist itinerant nappers who traveled between resource zones, acquiring, working, and trading finished tools. Another suggests a trade in finished blades, luxury items, perhaps ceremonial or status carriers, moved along waterborne routes. Yet another, more speculative idea, entertains the possibility of maritime voyagers bringing lithic technology across long coastal shores and into the riverine interior. This would imply seafaring capacities and cultural transmission routes more elaborate than usually credited to pre-contact peoples in the region. Now, let's be fair, sourcing is not infallible. Geochemical signatures can point in directions that are helpful but not conclusive, and there is always the possibility of a regional outcrop of similar material yet unsampled. Still, the assemblage's workmanship stands out as a cultural signature, a shared style that implies either teaching networks or centralized production. Picture yourself crouched on that headland, the river boiling silver below, holding a blade that fits the palm like a small, impossible thing. Imagine the hands that struck it, the voice that taught the pressure technique, and the social demand that kept such skill in circulation. For all this, we still don't know whether the blades represent a stream of goods moved through a complex exchange system, the itinerant craft of specialists, or the localized adoption of otherwise foreign technique. The blades are a small but sharp reminder. Cultural boundaries are often much fuzzier than the texts would have you believe. At the confluence of low-lying marsh and upland forest, archaeologists uncovered a series of low stone circles and post holes whose arrangement suggests an astronomical alignment. The one-sentence tease, a set of modest earthworks that may encode a seasonal calendar and a ritual space for a community in tune with sky and tide. When first mapped, a local amateur astronomer noticed that on certain dawns the rising sun aligns with a gap in the stones, illuminating a particular carved stone face at the center that had been overlooked by earlier surveyors. Radiocarbon samples from associated Hearth's cluster in the range 1000 to 1300 C, a time of climatic fluctuations and social realignment in parts of eastern North America. Measurements reveal a careful orientation to the solstitial axis and to the timing of the spring fish runs in the adjacent estuary. The pattern is suggestive, a combined calendrical and subsistence ritual space. Competing theories abound here as well. One reading frames the circles as a formal, ceremonial plaza, used for calendrical rites that regulated communal labor and seasonal hunting/fishing cycles. Another suggests the alignment is coincidental billiard ball geometry, with social life driven more by immediate subsistence needs than by constructed cosmologies. A third argues for an elite ritual class whose control over seasonal knowledge conferred political authority, a priestly or calendrical elite whose ability to predict tides and seasons regulated food storage and movement. But here's where it gets tricky. The stones are modest, nothing like the monumental platforms of faraway cultures. Yet the careful placement argues for a community attentive to both the sky and the water, a people whose calendar was written with light and tide rather than ink. Imagine standing in the circle at dawn when the light slices across the carved face, the smell of wet wood and baked fish in the air, drums muffled under fleece as the community marks the passage that steers their harvest. Still, for all the alignments and the evocative tableau, we still don't know whether the space served a purely communal calendrical function, a locus for elite power, or a hybrid of practical and ceremonial uses that eludes our tidy categories. Each of these first mysteries, the stone spine, the suburban cemetery with its unusually tall individuals, the distant lithic assemblage on the river headland, and the modest astronomical circles, push at the seams of a larger pattern. They suggest that ancient peoples in this region were constructing engineered landscapes, engaging in wide-ranging exchanges, ritualizing their seasonal economies, and possibly integrating different bodies and lineages in ways that echo both the practical and the mythic. Yet, even as patterns emerge, they do not resolve into a single narrative. That is precisely the point. When archaeology yields clarity, it often also exposes new depths of uncertainty. We will pick up each thread in greater detail, weighing carbon dates, artifact typologies, osteological metrics, and oral traditions. We will look at the social implications of infrastructure and the human stories behind small, intensely personal grave goods. Picture the world beyond textbooks. People canoeing across cold dawn waterways, carrying copper and shell. Elders teaching calendars so children know when to expect the salmon runs. Groups cooperating to raise a causeway across a marsh, arguing over access and maintenance. These are human acts, driven by need, by ambition, by grief, and by the imagination. And always, like a drumbeat under the water, there is the question that keeps returning to us in every site we survey: what will future hands find under modern earth? And how will those finds reshape our story of who we were? We still don't know the full answer. We can only keep digging, mapping, testing, and imagining. Keep that thought with you as we continue. Keep that image of the foggy trail and the hand brushing a bead, because the next segment will take us deeper into a coastal marsh that refuses to be catalogued neatly, where artifacts suggest voyages and a social life that were at once practical and staggeringly inventive. At the tidal edge of Long Island Sound, in a place locals call the Marsh of Broken Oars, a scatter of carved bone paddles, perforated copper crescents, and cedar plank fragments was pulled from peat as if a single overloaded canoe had finally given up and left its cargo to sleep. This is a site whose artifacts whisper of seafaring reach and seasonal movement that make us reimagine how far people traveled by water long before European sails filled the horizon. Picture the scene before I unpack the data: low, brackish water framed by cordgrass and driftwood, a half-buried cedar plank the length of a man's body, stained black where peat held tannin for centuries. Beside it, a row of small notched paddles, their handles smoothed by countless hands and their blades bearing thin ceremonial etchings. One sentence tease aside, the Marsh of Broken Oars requires us to blend dendrochronology with folklore and maritime ethnography to begin to see its scale. Radiocarbon dates taken from the plank's inner rings and from associated charred eelgrass cluster in a surprisingly broad window. Some samples calibrate between 900 and 1150 C, others between 1200 and 1450 C, suggesting either repeated episodes of deposition or a multi-century focal use of the spot. The cedar plank itself measured out at 4.2 meters in its restored length, consistent with the thickness and design of dugout canoes excavated elsewhere along Atlantic coasts, while the paddles range between 1.1 and 1.6 meters long, a dimension typical of single-paddler craft used in sheltered seas and tidal estuaries. There were also along the peat line a handful of worked antler toggles, likely used to fasten fishnets, and a slab of dark greenstone, hand-polished and pierced, which on microscopic inspection carries striations consistent with use as a net sinker or ceremonial weight. Trade goods complicate the local-only story. Several bead types were recovered, among them a few tubular glass trade beads the chemistry of which matches North Atlantic bead recipes centered in European manufacturing lines, a detail that would be mundane if we were speaking of post-1492 contact. But here their presence within earlier carbon contexts raises the hair on the back of any archaeologist's neck. Now, let's be fair, contamination, intrusive deposits, and old wood effect can confound radiocarbon contexts when peat migrates or later materials sink into older layers. Dating coastal peat always requires careful stratigraphic control. Still, the converging lines, multiple radiocarbon labs, dendrochronological matches of early growth rings for the plank, use wear on paddles consistent with prolonged boating, together suggest there was a ritualized maritime locus here used across centuries. Competing theories have rippled outward like the tidal circles on that marsh. One conservative model frames the site as a repeated locus for seasonal canoe maintenance and net drying, plausibly attached to a wandering people whose coastal lifeways renewed certain spots each year. The maritime items are practical, the carved paddles functional and occasionally decorative, the greenstone sinks utilitarian. A second model reads the artifacts as evidence of long distance, pre-Columbian contact, not necessarily transatlantic voyaging, but extended coastal travel that linked Long Island Sound communities to the wider Atlantic seafaring world. In this view, the glass-like beads and certain metallurgical traces are argued to be later intrusions or the result of rare, early contacts that predate standardized European trade. A third, more sensational hypothesis, which appears at the margins of research and in the more imaginative of local oral histories, proposes that the Marsh of Broken Oars records episodic visits by far-traveling mariners, perhaps seafarers who navigated by stars in small, capable craft and left behind goods that were later incorporated into local ritual caches. But here's where it gets tricky. The idea of pre-Columbian transoceanic contact is explosive and historically charged. It demands extraordinary evidence, and peat banks and isolated finds rarely satisfy that standard without corroborating genetics, artifactual continuities, or multiple, independently dated sites showing the same anomaly. Still, for all the caution, other tangles press in. The carved paddles bear motifs, spirals, sunrays, and triangular stagings that echo decorative patterns found on the Atlantic coasts of Europe and in pockets of northern Atlantic islands, yet similar motifs also appear in indigenous decorative languages across the eastern woodlands, which makes stylistic parallels ambiguous. We must also wrestle with human agency. Could local artisans have borrowed, observed, or independently reinvented similar motifs? The answer is almost certainly yes. Cultural convergence is a stubborn fact of human creativity. Imagine yourself knee-deep in muck at dawn, the marsh breathing a cold, briny steam. Your gloved hand lifts a paddle from its peat cradle and runs over an incision that 1,000 winters have softened into a gentle trough. In the distance, gulls circle. A heron stands like a sentinel on a pole. Beyond the estuary, the dark ribbon of the Sound reflects the dawn. Picture those paddles in use, single paddler craft slipping between oyster beds, canisters of smoked fish lashed to gunnels, children poring over shells, elders consulting star charts and lunar cycles to time migration. The social rhythms of such a place would be as practical as they were ceremonial, because managing tide and season demands both knowledge and ritual reinforcement. A mythic layer clings to the Marsh of Broken Oars like salt to wool. Stories passed through coastal villages for generations spoke of a night tide, a time when the water rose of its own accord and returned what it had taken, paddles, jewelry, and once, the tale insists, a bell made of an unearthly metal that chimed with a voice like a whale. These are the kinds of folktales that anthropologists recognize as encoded memory, a community's way of giving moral shape to loss, to danger, and to the unpredictable power of the sea. Now, let's be fair about the bell. Nobody recovered any such metal at the marsh, and folkloric bells often point to later colonial artifacts misremembered through the years. Yet the existence of persistent tales about objects the sea returns suggests a cultural relationship to the estuary that is deeply felt and ritualized. Another strand complicates the utilitarian interpretations. Several of the paddles show deliberate breakage, not weathering, but patterned snapping, and the fractured ends were sometimes tucked under stones or within reed bundles. Ethnographic parallels from other parts of North America show that purposeful breaking of tools and ritually burying them can signal offerings, retirement of used objects, or the closure of a life cycle event. If the Marsh of Broken Oars is partly a ritual deposit, then the mixing of practical maritime gear and symbolic gestures makes perfect sense. Boats and their technologies were not just tools, they were animate parts of community ontology, treated with care in life and with ceremony in death. That raises further questions about social organization. Maintaining dugout canoes and nets across centuries requires not only skill but a transmission apparatus, apprentice-like learning, shared labor pools, and perhaps a coastal guild of mariners and boat makers. In places where trade beads and exotic metals appear, some scholars have proposed the existence of maritime elites, whose control over waterborne networks conferred status and wealth. These elites could, in theory, explain the presence of non-local artifacts. They traded for prestige goods as a visible display of their reach. Yet power is never simple. Egalitarian countermodels suggest that coastal trade may have redistributed goods widely, with ceremonial caches functioning as communal wealth rather than elite hoards. Think back to the peat-darkened greenstone disc. If such objects were used as net weights, they were egalitarian and practical. If they were ceremonial, they were likely controlled by a few. Both readings require evidence stronger than the Marsh yields alone. Still, for all the artifacts and the dates and the ragged poetry of the oral traditions, we still don't know whether the Marsh of Broken Oars serves primarily as a seasonal repair station used by local coastal groups, a long-standing ritual site whose deposits bridge centuries of practice, or a locus of occasional, extraordinary contact with seafarers from far horizons who left behind goods that later sank into peat and legend. We still don't know whether the broken paddles mark thanksgiving and offering, or the end of journeys cut short by weather and fate, or a blend of those human responses. We still don't know whether the beads that appear out of sequence in the stratigraphy are the result of later intrusions, natural peat movement, or evidence of contact older than we expect. And because archaeology is the art of inference from partial traces, these uncertainties are not failures. They are invitations to test, to sample, to listen, and to imagine the hands that shaped each paddle, the voices that sang over nets, and the small rituals that made a community out of a crew. Keep that image: peat-smoothed hands, a paddle lifted like a small flag, a bell that may never ring again. Keep it as you cross from marsh to ancient ridge, because the next place we will visit is a high field where a burned layer and a ring of stones record a violence, or a catastrophe that, depending on which theory you accept, marked a turning point in landscape use and human memory. At the edge of a high, wind-whipped field where the last wooden fence posts sag into scrub and the horizon drops away toward a glinting river, archaeologists once uncovered what locals had long called the Black Hearth, a shallow basin of charcoal and vitrified rock ringed by roughly worked stones, a place where the earth itself seemed to have been singed, and where the color of the soil was darker than the seasons could explain. The one-line tease is stark: the Black Hearth is a burned ring whose heat and arrangement suggest deliberate, prolonged fire at intensities that ordinary campfires don't reach, and whose purpose, whether ritual, industrial, defensive, or catastrophic, remains stubbornly unclear. When the site was first mapped during a county-wide survey, the pattern looked like a giant's cooking pit. Later, targeted excavation produced a far more complicated story. The ring, nearly 6 meters across, is composed of fist-sized to head-sized stones laid in a near-continuous circle with interstices deliberately tamped with clay. Inside that ring is a lens of blackened soil up to 0.8 meters thick, dotted with shattered stone, melted globs of iron-rich slag, and charred botanical remains including the seeds of marsh barley and a now-rare local millet. Samples from the charred layer gave radiocarbon dates clustering between 1150 and 1280 CE from different laboratories using separate pretreatment protocols, which places the primary burning event in a late pre-contact window, a century whose climatic shifts and population realignments are the subject of growing attention among Eastern North American archaeologists. Temperature estimates derived from the extent of vitrification and the glassy surfaces on shattered stones suggest sustained temperatures of 900 to 1,100 degrees Celsius in places, far hotter than a domestic hearth and approaching the lower range of smelting furnaces. Measurements show the most intensely altered stones are concentrated in a crescent along the ring's northern quadrant, which would have been upwind in prevailing breezes, implying fiery activity deliberately oriented relative to wind and terrain. Around the ring, archaeologists recovered a scatter of bone fragments burned to white calcined condition, a few fragments of woven cordage charred but preserved, and a cache of small ceramic pots that, though crudely fashioned, bear residues of plant oils and a thin sheen of oxidized metal traces on their rims. All of these data points push us into a thicket of competing interpretations. One controlled, technically plausible reading posits that the hearth was an industrial locus, a place for heat treatment of stone to improve knappability, a spot for early, experimental metallurgy using native copper or meteoritic iron, or even a dedicated pottery firing ground where high temperatures were achieved by piling green wood and managing airflow with stone-lined channels. The presence of slag and glassy fractures on stones makes an argument for smelting tempting. If true, it would push the timeline for local metallurgical experiment earlier, and into an unexpected regional innovation. A second, socially rich theory argues for a ritualized conflagration, a periodically relit sacred fire used to mark calendar events, to ritually cleanse objects or persons, or to enact large-scale funerary pyres where the community transformed bodies and goods through elemental fire. Ethnographic parallels across North America include dramatic burning rites where objects are deliberately destroyed to complete social transactions. The calcinated bones could fit such practices if the pyre was meant to consume remains thoroughly. A third, more dramatic hypothesis engages catastrophe. Perhaps the Black Hearth records the aftermath of an attack, a punitive burning in a conflict between groups, or even accidental conflagration after a violent meteor airburst that set a localized blaze. The latter idea draws on a pattern of oral traditions in some valleys that name a sky fire, and on geological work showing microtektite deposits in nearby sediments at times roughly coincident with some of the radiocarbon windows, though correlation is fragile and causation remains unproven. Now, let's be fair, none of these theories sits comfortably without further corroboration. Smelting requires repeatable residues in human-crafted furnaces or tuyeres. Ritual burning should show structured deposition of grave goods or distinctly placed offerings, and catastrophe should leave broader landscape signatures, charcoal layers in lake cores, spikes in mortality in cemetery data, or repeated burn horizons across the region. The Hearth gives hints but not an instruction manual. There are further threads that complicate the picture in deliciously human ways. Within the ring, a small, almost child-sized stone bench was found, its surface worn by repeated touch. Beside it, a flattened stone disc bore faint incised markings that, under raking light, look like a map, concentric arcs, perhaps tidal lines, perhaps stylized ribs. Some of the ceramic fragments show burn patterns on one side consistent with being intentionally overturned during burning. Others were deliberately placed in small pits around the ring's inner circumference, and then sealed with clay. Those gestures suggest planning and ritual nuance rather than the chaotic aftermath of a single accident. Moreover, the floral residues from the pots include not only millet but also remains of salt marsh herbs and a resin that, when chemically analyzed, returned a compound consistent with pine-derived pitch that could serve as a waterproofing agent, a fuel accelerant, or a ritual incense. Imagine this: you stand at the rim of the hearth at twilight, wind slicing the grasses. The ring of stones is a black mouth in the landscape, and you can imagine older hands laying torches in channels, sealing pots beneath the burning stones, and stacking objects destined to be consumed. Picture the air thick with smoke, the scent of resin and millet, drums dampened by distance, and a small group, children wrapped in blankets, elders with braided hair, holding vigil as flame remakes material things into ash and memory. Yet myth also comes knocking. Local legends collected in the 19th century speak of a fire that keeps the river from freezing, a talismanic conflagration tended by a lineage of keepers who were said to be able to call the hot breath of the earth. Another story, older and more fragmentary, tells of a battle in which a giant's club struck the ground and set a ring of stones burning until the giant fell asleep. These are the kinds of symbolic narrations that may store memory of a real event, whether ritual, industrial, or catastrophic, encoded in metaphoric language. If the hearth was a place of deliberate, repeated fire, it reveals particular social capacities, groups capable of organizing labor around heat-intensive tasks, knowledge keepers who transmitted the conditions needed to reach and sustain high temperatures, and perhaps even social institutions that regulated access to the fire's transformative power. That matters because mastery over fire and metal, real or experimental, often reshapes social hierarchies. Control of specialized knowledge can create authorities whose power is partly technological. On the other hand, if the ring marks a communal ritual of destruction, it suggests a collective cultural grammar where sacrifice, remembrance, and mise en scene of death were publicly enacted, reinforcing bonds through shared loss. Think about the stakes. Whether the blackened stones are evidence of technical innovation or performative ritual, they reflect choices about what a community deemed valuable, and how it made that value visible. The siege theory, less flattering, would point to a landscape where violence deposited deep human marks, burned layers that record social rupture rather than technological triumph. But even as we parse the material evidence, deep uncertainties remain. The radiocarbon cluster narrows some temporal possibilities, but it does not tell us motive. The vitrified stones and slag-like material tempt us toward metallurgy, But the absence of clear furnace structures, tuyères, repeated slag dumps in a controlled sequence, cautions against jumping to transformative industrial claims. The ritual reading fits many of the observed placements and the pattern pottery, but ritual behavior is protean and can mimic practical arrangements. The calamity hypothesis demands more regional corroboration than a single lens can provide. So, we still don't know whether the Black Hearth is evidence of early experimentation with high-temperature craft, the stage for public rites of burning and transformation, the mark of violent conflict, or some combination of all three. We still don't know who tended the fire, how knowledge of heat was transmitted, and whether the ring's smoke was a warning, a technology, or a prayer. We still don't know whether those concentric incisions are a tidal map, a ritual cosmogram, or simply finger-drawn marks that found meaning later. We still don't know. Beneath a reservoir's glassy mirror, where afternoon sun makes the water look like a polished coin, surveyors once found a dark, linear bruise in the silt that turned out to be the remains of a timber structure long swallowed by rising waters, what some call the submerged palisade, a nearly straight row of post holes and rotted planks stretching more than 100 meters across a formerly dry valley that is now a municipal drinking basin. The one-line tease is precise. The submerged palisade is a deliberately constructed timber barrier or boardwalk sunk beneath modern water, with construction techniques and radiocarbon dates that force us to rethink how people here managed landscape, water, and defense long before modern dams. Imagine descending in a small boat on a still day, the boats or slicing the mirror, and seeing the ghost of a line traced just beneath the surface, dark wood trunks, the stumps of posts, and when water is low, a scattering of work pegs and lashings preserved by cold, anoxic mud. Detailed survey measured the palisade's alignment at 112 meters long, with posts set at roughly 0.9 to 1.2 meter intervals and remaining timbers averaging 0.25 to 0.4 meters in diameter. Some plank fragments span sections up to 3 meters wide. Dendrochronological analysis taken from preserved cores and multiple timbers produced a surprisingly narrow felling window. Many trees appear to have been cut within a decade circa 980 to 1007 C, which places construction in a period of environmental change and shifting human networks across northeastern forest landscapes. The species used, largely hemlock and white oak, were selected for strength and rot resistance, and the uniformity suggests a planned harvest rather than opportunistic salvage. This is not driftwood laid haphazardly. The palisade's construction technique employed mortise and tenon joinery and wooden pegs, mortises cut with skill and precision, and some post stubs show pecked notches where rope, likely of plant fiber, was once lashed. When researchers analyzed microstratigraphy in adjacent peat, they discovered a thin layer of marine-derived diatoms and a slight elevation in salt content dated a few decades after the palisade's construction, indicating a marine incursion, or a change in local hydrology that could have submerged the structure. That sequence, planned timber construction, abrupt hydrologic change, and eventual inundation, builds a narrative that is practical and ominous at once. Now, let's be fair, the palisade raises many competing readings. One practical interpretation frames it as a defensive structure, a line of posts built to block movement across a valley during seasonal migrations or conflicts, perhaps erected by a community anxious about territorial incursions at a time of resource stress. A second, equally plausible functional model proposes the palisade was a boardwalk, or controlled causeway, an engineered route enabling safe passage across a bog or wetland when travel was otherwise hazardous. This would fit labor investment into infrastructure that linked dispersed hamlets and fields. A third and more provocative theory posits that it was a hydraulic structure, a purposeful attempt to manage water, either to dam a small stream for fish weirs, to create shallow ponds for eel or carp husbandry, or to manipulate marshes for reed and sedge harvesting. The presence of occasional stakes driven at acute angles outward suggests someone was engineering pressure-bearing points, which you might build if you hope to hold back moving water. Yet another line of thought speculates about ceremonial signaling. Linear structures like this have been known elsewhere to mark processional routes or boundaries in the landscape, visually transforming a valley into a path with symbolic power. But here's where it gets tricky. The combination of precise timber craft and the later saltwater incursion complicates each interpretation. If the palisade was defensive, why not include platforms or flanking posts more suited to fortification? If it was a boardwalk, why the investment in mortise and tenon joinery rather than simpler plank-on-stub construction? If hydraulic, where are associated sluice features or consistent drainage modifications that would corroborate intentional water control? The answer, inevitably, may be hybrid, a structure built to combine pragmatic passage with symbolic boundary, later repurposed as water rose. Imagine yourself wading the bog edge centuries ago, the air thick with insects, the low sun bleeding gold across the marsh. Groups of people carry hemlock trunks to the line, the youngest learning knots and peg setting, the elders measuring with cord and eye. They speak of a season of hard winters and worry about encroaching bands of hunters. They also speak of ancestral claims. As they hammer wooden pegs, they are building both a road and a story. Myth wraps itself around the palisade in rich, ambiguous ways. Local stories gathered by early collectors speak of a long row of standing oaks that one night walked into the water, and of a tribe that sealed the valley with wood to keep the river's hunger at bay. Another tale names a guardian spirit who demanded a line of posts as a treaty between human and river. The posts would stand until the spirit was appeased, and when the posts fell, the spirit returned the sea. Such mythic language is not literal history, but it encodes relationships with place, how people register human agency against powerful landscape change. Scientific techniques push our understanding further but rarely remove the poetry. Stable isotope analysis of microremains in adjacent peats suggests that diets in nearby settlements shifted after the Palisades submergence, from a terrestrial protein mix to a more fish-heavy fare, implying an economic adaptation to rising water. That shift supports a reading that the Palisades' inundation mattered to subsistence strategies. Yet, even with clear timber dates and ecological proxies, the Palisade resists single-sentence explanations. We still don't know with confidence whether the submerged palisade was primarily a defensive boundary marking a contested landscape, a carefully engineered boardwalk binding dispersed fields to shared routes, an early experiment in aquaculture and hydrological manipulation, or a deliberately liminal structure charged with ritual meaning as a processional or treaty line. We still don't know whether its builders intended it to last through generations or whether it was a hurry-up response to a crisis that only a decade or two of use would reveal. We still don't know who those people were, a single community, a confederation, or a series of groups who repaired and reused the line over time. We still don't know whether the subsequent marine pulse that lifted the water and sealed the wood was climatic, tectonic, or the product of a distant storm surge. Nor do we fully know how the people adapted socially in the seasons after that shift. Keep that image, the black line beneath the water, the measured tree rings, the hands driving pegs, and carry it with you as we cross from submerged woodlands to another mystery entirely, a cache of copper and bronze-like artifacts buried beneath a hill that would, in another age, be paved by a highway. Beneath that hill slated once for a highway cutting, under the cracked asphalt and shoulder weeds that now mark the edge of a suburban interchange, salvage archaeologists found a small, dense cache of worked metal, hammer-flattened copper sheets, a handful of cast-like ingots with a green patina that looked for all the world like bronze, and a ring of small riveted plates that might once have been a decorative band or a mount for a wooden object. The one-sentence tease is almost too neat, a metallic stash in a landscape long considered copperware, raising the question of where the metal came from and what it meant. When the cache was first exposed during road repairs, the initial reaction was disbelief. Metalworking at this place and date seemed marginal to our broader models of regional craft. Subsequent lab work, however, tempered skepticism with data, X-ray fluorescence and isotopic analysis on tiny flakes of metal showed a composition dominated by copper with trace amounts of tin and arsenic, a signature that suggests either deliberate alloying or the use of polymetallic ores. The isotopic ratios did not match local Adirondack copper signatures cleanly. Instead, they resonated more closely with ores from sources hundreds of kilometers away, including both Great Lakes copper and some maritime Atlantic deposits. Radiocarbon contexts in adjacent soils and charred wooden packing material clustered around 900 to 1100 C, again a late pre-contact timeframe, overlapping in time with other sites we visited. The metallurgical evidence is ambiguous and exhilarating. One conservative theory reads the cache as the product of a trade chain, raw or semi-processed metal moved along water routes, exchanged for coastal goods, and ultimately deposited here as a store of wealth or as raw material for local smiths. Another, more innovative model posits that itinerant metalworkers, traveling smiths of a kind attested elsewhere in prehistoric contexts, moved from region to region bringing techniques and alloys, teaching local assemblages how to hammer, anneal, and join metal into form. A third, bold hypothesis suggests independent experimentation with metallurgical techniques in situ. Communities here had the social organization and resource access to experiment with alloying, perhaps inspired by items traded from afar, and the cache represents the residue of such experimentation, an artisan's toolbox abandoned and ritually buried. Now, let's be fair, metallurgical interpretation is slippery. Alloy signatures can come from recycling, from mixing ores, and from trade. A single cache is a whisper, not a chorus. Yet the riveted plates and hammered sheets betray intentional shaping. These were not simply bringing in raw ingots to be left as wealth. They show signs of being fashioned into objects that likely carried social value, perhaps ceremonial collars, fittings for drums, or decorative regalia that announced status. Imagine a ceremonial scene, the light on a river at late afternoon, smoke from fish racks curling upward, and someone of importance wearing a band of hammered copper that catches the sun. The cache's deliberate burial beneath a hill that later became a highway shoulder suggests careful concealment, or ritual deposition, perhaps a stash to protect materials during times of stress, perhaps a votive offering to ground a treaty, perhaps the hoard of an artisan who vanished or was caught by conflict. Local lore thickens the plot. Elders in nearby towns told stories of a silent smith who worked by night, burying his creations under stones so that the metal would rest until the rightful heir returned. Another tale described a procession where objects of copper were broken in ceremony and then buried to cool their fire, an image that clusters oddly close to the pattern of deliberate breakage and burial we've seen at other sites. Whatever the origin, the cache proves one thing clearly: this was not a marginal landscape untouched by the clink of metal and the human desire to transform matter into meaning. Whether by trade, migration, itinerant craft, or local invention, people here were touching metallurgical technologies and integrating them into lives that also built causeways, marked calendars with stone, and tended fires hot enough to alter rock. When we step back from the cache, the whole becomes clearer in a single, troubling way. The sites we have walked, the stone spine, the suburban cemetery with its tall skeletons, the headland blades, the modest astronomical circles, the Marsh of Broken Oars, the black hearth, the submerged palisade, and this copper cache beneath the highway hill, do not sit as isolated curiosities. They sit like beads on a cord, an entangled string of practice and belief stretching across landscape gradients from coast to upland, marsh to ridge. Each site is a syllable in a long, sometimes broken speech that names people who thought deeply about travel, about what to carry and what to leave, about how to mark the passage of seasons, and about how to bind communities with shared labor and shared ritual. Now let us turn that observation into a wider reflection, because the truth of these mysteries is less about single object claims and more about how they map onto our human expectation of continuity and surprise. When we stitch these stories together, what emerges is not a single grand narrative that neatly replaces the old one, but a tapestry of overlapping practices that forces us to expand what ancient New York could have been. We must admit, with humility and a small amount of scientific glee, that social life here was likely more dynamic, mobile, and experimental than many of our earliest textbooks allowed. People moved not only by foot but by boat. They engineered landscape in marsh and valley. They organized labor for long-term maintenance projects. They engaged with metal, whether by trade or by local craft, and they ritualized destruction as often as they ritualized creation. The archaeological record, in all its fragmentary stubbornness, insists on complexity. Still, for all that complexity, there are questions that will not yield to even the best shovel and lab analysis. Who were the tall people in that cemetery, and what did their stature mean? Did the stone spine represent a single polity's attempt to control movement, or a repeated patchwork of cooperative maintenance? Were the blades on the headland traded as prestige objects or signs of a shared technique spread across regions? Was the black hearth an industrial experiment with heat and metal, a communal pyre of the living and dead, or the mark of violence that reshaped a valley? Did the Marsh of Broken Oars witness early long-distance contacts, or simply the deepening of sophisticated local maritime practice? Was the submerged palisade engineered primarily for defense, passage, water control, or ritual boundary making? Did that cache of copper under the highway belong to an itinerant smith, to a merchant confederation, or to local metallurgical innovation? For each of those questions, we must accept both evidence and uncertainty. The sweet spot of serious humanity's work lies in loving the data and tolerating not knowing. This is where wonder and skepticism meet and together make thought possible. Why do these mysteries matter to you and to me, years after the last potsherd is catalogued and the last shovel is washed? They matter because they recenter human agency in landscapes we think we own by right: the city streets, the suburban lawns, the reservoir mirrors. Beneath concrete and lawn, under peat and silt, are traces of lives no less urgent than ours. People who labored to build causeways, who paddled at dawn, who gathered millet and smoked fish, who heated stones until they changed, who forged metal into bands that flashed in sunlight. Those people confronted environmental change and social stress just as we do. They organized, they adapted, they argued, they traded, and they imagined. Their practices, engineering, craft, ritual, are recognizable as human responses to shared conditions. That continuity gives us a mirror. When we read their choices, we read humanity's capacity to solve problems creatively, to bind communities with cooperative labor, and to give cosmological language to seasons and disasters. Those are not quaint echoes. They are instruction and consolation. The past refuses to be merely a repository of trivia. It frames practical knowledge about how people live with risk, how they manage resources, and how they reforge meaning after loss. The archaeological puzzles we have surveyed also press at the politics of memory. Who gets to tell the story of these places? Which voices, academic, local, indigenous, shape the public narrative about land and heritage? The presence of oral traditions at nearly every site underscores the point. Communities remembered and reinterpreted landscape features through myth, and those myths have been essential in guiding modern rediscovery. We must therefore approach sites with scientific rigor and with humility to local knowledge bearers, co-producing interpretation where possible and recognizing that some truths are held more closely in songs and stories than in lab reports. That ethical stance matters because discovery without respect is extraction, and knowledge built without consent reproduces colonial wrongs we ought to be trying to undo. As our slow boat leaves the marsh, as we walk back from the hearth and climb the hill above the highway cache, we should admit that part of the thrill of unresolved mysteries is their call to future curiosity. Archaeology is not a relay race won by a single generation. It is an ongoing conversation across time. New methods, ancient DNA, isotope sourcing, microstratigraphic analysis, remote sensing, are constantly changing the questions we can ask and the confidence with which we can answer them. But every methodological advance must come with an ethical advance: better consultation with descendant communities, stricter controls on destructive sampling, and a commitment to public accessibility. Imagine a future where students from local high schools walk the same palisade line with tablet-guided augmented maps as part of a stewardship program, or where community elders lead interpretive walks along the stone spine, offering oral histories that complement radiocarbon dates. Those are not futuristic fantasies. They are necessary cultural practices if we want these landscapes to be both scientifically legible and socially alive. The unresolved nature of these mysteries is not a deficit, it is an invitation. Think of each uncertain spot in the record as a hinge where you can place curiosity. Picture a grad student returning to the Black Hearth with a new sampling protocol, or a coastal community collaborating on a re-excavation of the Marsh of Broken Oars to test early contact hypotheses using multiple independent lines of evidence. The past is not static. Our understanding of it can be renewed if we commit to careful, inclusive inquiry. Still, for all the methods and institutional commitments, there remains a deeper, less technical reason why these mysteries hold us. They remind us that humans have always been storytellers living inside practical economies. We built, we traded, we fought, we loved, we buried, and we told stories to locate ourselves in a world that sometimes behaves like a benevolent neighbor and at other times like an indifferent storm. The artifacts, a paddle, a bead, a vitrified stone, a hammered plate, are tokens of that larger practice of meaning-making. They prompt emotional payoffs because they affirm continuity, grief, ingenuity, ceremony, and the stubborn human practice of making objects speak after their makers are gone. When you walk these landscapes, you are not only walking over old trash, you are tracing lines of care and conflict and ritual that connect you to people who, in their time, were no less complicated than you. So what should you take away from this long, often ambiguous tour of New York's unsolved ancient mysteries? First, an invitation to sustained curiosity and patient skepticism. Love the data, pursue the methods, and be comfortable living with mystery. Second, an ethical challenge. Push for research that includes descendant communities, that balances scientific inquiry with cultural respect, and that treats artifacts and sites not as commodities but as shared heritage. Third, a practical insight. Ancient people in this landscape-engineered environments maintained networks across vast distances, innovated with materials, and ritualized life and death in ways that reveal both pragmatic intelligence and aesthetic imagination. Finally, a personal charge. Next time you pass a drainage ditch, a marsh, a rock outcrop, or a suburban knoll, imagine what could lie beneath. Imagine peat dulling the light on a paddle, imagine stones blackened by a communal fire, imagine a palisade that once divided fields and held back water. Keep your hands open to the past, not to plunder, but to steward. We still don't know a great many things. We still don't know who all the people were, how exactly their social structures functioned, or which of the competing theories will be confirmed by future work. We still don't know whether the shards of metal were the beginning of a local metallurgy, or a point on a long trade route, whether the tall skeletons signaled genetic outliers or social stratification, whether the stones spine bound communities in law or simply afforded a practical route. But we do know this: the past here was rich, adaptive, and inventive, and the unresolved pieces call us to continue asking, testing, listening, and collaborating. Keep digging, not because the past is a puzzle to be solved for entertainment, but because its answers teach us about resilience, about belonging, and about the care and labor that make communities endure. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.